Mr Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I have great pleasure in making this statement on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee on the fourth report from the Foreign Affairs Committee on the International Court of Justice. The Chair, the Honourable Member for Turnbridge and Malling, and some of the committee are actually in Birmingham today with the committee, so send their apologies. And given the Foreign Affairs Committee travel to some of the most challenging places in the world, little did they think that Birmingham might be the most challenging yet, getting there and back today. Madam Deputy Speaker, in November last year, the UK Government was unable to secure re-election of the UK Judge Sir Christopher Greenwood to the UN International Court of Justice. As a result, the UK is not represented on the ICJ for the first time since the court's creation in 1946. Sir Christopher was first elected to the ICJ in 2009, but despite his impeccable record and what the FCO told us was a long and extensive lobbying campaign, he lost to candidates from France, Somalia, India, Brazil and Lebanon. And on the 6th of February, the Lebanese candidate was sworn into the International Court of Justice, therefore signalling an end to Christopher Greenwood's 9-year term of office. This is a bitterly disappointing diplomatic failure and can only be a step in the wrong direction for what the FCO describe as global Britain. This follows recent setbacks and vote losses at the UN, such as the vote on the Chagos Islands. During voting rounds, the UK's candidate's support in the UN General Assembly fell away sharply, leading to a run-off with the candidate from India, which ended in what they call deadlock. Further rounds of voting led to no improvement in the UK's position, despite consistent support on the UN Security Council. And on the 21st of November, the government conceded the contest to the Indian candidate. This loss is of deep concern. One of the key strengths of the UK is our commitment to multilateral governance and to the application of the international rule of law. These commitments will need to play a key part in the UK's future foreign policy strategy and in any global Britain agenda. We conclude that the lack of a UK judge on the ICJ harms the UK's influence on the global stage and the UK's future foreign policy strategy. We had a number of possible reasons for the UK's failure from ministers and former UK diplomats to the United Nations. These ranged from the popularity of other candidates, to regional allegiances, to a wider shift in power away from the permanent five of the Security Council, despite the French candidate being re-elected. Perhaps the most concerning reasons, however, was offered by Lord Haney, a former UK permanent representative to the UN. He suggested it might be an indication that the UK's international standing had diminished, and there might have been a fall in what he dubbed the UK's trepidation index. That's how far other countries worry about treading on the UK's toes. So what are the next steps? The FCO used tactics that had worked in the past and were surprised they did not work this time around. They expected Sir Christopher to win. The UK mission in New York lobbied extensively, as did the FCO's network in London and overseas, and as did government ministers during bilateral discussions. But this did not work. We are also concerned that the FCO does not appear to be particularly curious about why the support of other countries in the General Assembly fell away, nor do ministers seem too interested in finding out the reasons why the support for the UK diminished against what had been promised to them previously by other nations. When we asked the Minister what reasons had been given to him by other countries, he was unable to give any definitive answer. Lord Ahmed, from the other place, the Minister of State for the Commonwealth and the UN, did place some emphasis on building a Commonwealth caucus, but was unable to tell the committee how many Commonwealth countries, of course not including India, who defeated the UK, voted for the UK candidate. The FCO has rightly launched an extensive internal exercise to identify the reasons for the failure and to learn the lessons for future contests. The FCO intends to keep the findings of this exercise private, but for the sake of accountability to Parliament and to the public, we recommend that the FCO share its findings with the Foreign Affairs Committee so we can assure ourselves that the FCO is taking the required action. The FCO should also inform the Committee each time it intends to campaign for a UN position so we can help. However, without the benefit of incumbency, the next opportunity to elect a judge of the ICJ will be much more difficult, and the FCO needs to prove it can adapt its approach. One resource the FCO does need to make full use of is Parliament itself. Members in this place and across the Chamber and in the other place have international experience and networks that can be mobilised, and we have all been part of election campaigns that may be able to help. We recommend the Government briefs the Committee and other relevant parliamentary groups on future elections to make best use of this resource. We have to ensure that the UK's influence and guidance on international organisations such as the United Nations is not diminished or diminishing, and that is why the FCO Lessons Report is critical to determine the causes behind this embarrassing defeat. And I commend this statement to the House.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his statement and to the Select Committee for their work. Would he agree that this is particularly disappointing because the United Kingdom has historically an immensely high reputation in international law and international tribunals, has some of the most experienced and highly regarded international lawyers, of whom Sir Christopher Greenwood is one, and does he consider that perhaps one of the lessons to be learned here, in contrast to what happened in France, is that we must be particularly careful as a government, particularly as we leave the European Union, not to give any signals that we have reduced the value and importance that we place upon international rules-based legal systems and international tribunals, and that will remain central to the attention of Her Majesty's Foreign Office going forward.
Ian Murray.
I agree with the honourable gentleman. The committee took evidence from the former UN ambassador from the UK to the UN, who made those exact points. The UK was very much at the forefront of developing the international rules-based system, and we have to be very careful that France doesn't become the voice of Europe in the UN Security Council and therefore becomes the voice of the UN in terms of the place that perhaps the UK should be taking. There is, by convention, but by convention only, 2 places on the international on the ICJ for a European or Western power, and the very fact the UK is not there maybe shows you in some way that the power of the UK and the influence of the UK is much diminished.
Mike Gates.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my honourable friend, and can I congratulate him for the way he's introduced our report, does my friend fear that this decision having taken place while we are still inside the European Union, if we leave the European Union, we will have even less influence in the future?
Ian Murray.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, who distinguished former chair and also sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. But there is real danger in the answer I gave to the previous question that France becomes the voice of the European Union in the UN Security Council and therefore the UN General Assembly, and that means the UK's voice is diminished. There was no direct implications for Brexit in this report, mainly because the Minister refused to answer if Brexit was a reason for this defeat, but there is no doubt that the UK's international voice is much diminished as a result of Brexit.
Philip Hollowbone.
Could I congratulate the honourable gentleman on his statement and on his committee for its report? Reading the report, it doesn't strike me that this is about the loss of UK influence in the world. To me, it smacks of complete cock-up as far as the Foreign Commonwealth Office is concerned, with a lack of ministerial direction about the importance of resecuring this post, and, frankly, the civil service messing up the procedure for securing the re-election of our representative. No wonder they don't want to share the internal report with the committee, because it would be embarrassing to senior civil servants and to the minister concerned. So could I encourage his committee to pursue the cock-up theory rather than the loss of overall influence of this country in the world?
Ian Murray.
Well, the honourable gentleman does raise a perfectly valid point, and we have said as one of our recommendations in the report that the lessons learned FCO report should come before the committee, even on a private basis, so the committee can be assured that this was a cock-up and not something wider. Although I would draw the honourable gentleman's attention to the fact that this is a process that the Foreign Office have used on a number of elections in previous years that have been successful, and I think perhaps had the diminishing vote in the General Assembly been brought to the attention of the Foreign Secretary sooner, that may or may not have helped, depending on whether or not the Foreign Secretary may or may not help those particular processes. But the points you make will certainly be taken back to the committee and used in future reports.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, I think it is a blow to international influence, and certainly any notion of Empire 2.0. And in fact, does he agree that that kind of language and attitude is perhaps in fact a contributing factor to this kind of decision, as also the decision to refer the Chagos Islands case to the ICJ, which he mentioned? And does he think that this lack of a judge on the ICJ now might have any, or does the committee intend to look into whether the lack of a judge on the ICJ might have any influence on the decision that it makes on the Chagos Islands case, although, from my point of view, certainly restoring the right to return would be welcome.
Ian Murray.
Well, specifically to the honourable gentleman who I thank for the question, the Chagos Islands issue is not mentioned directly in the report, although it was used as an example of where the UK have taken votes to the UN and lost them in recent times. But it's quite clear that the UK not being on the ICJ does diminish the UK's voice in terms of making sensible decisions at the UN. And the real difficulty, which is one of the conclusions in the report, is not the loss directly as a result of the judge on the ICJ, but indeed how we get a judge back on to the ICJ. Incumbency is a very, very special thing in terms of being able to promote a future election, and indeed not being the incumbent this time will make it much more difficult.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder whether my honourable friend got the same impression as I did, which was that repeated witnesses said to us that there was a kind of shrug going on around the world in international meetings where people went, what on earth are you doing, Britain, in regards to Brexit? Why are you choosing to step back from your international role? And that might have contributed to this. And then a second kind of shrug, which was a shrug from all the government ministers who seemed to go, well, you know, you win some, you lose some, does it really matter? And if that's the sense that permeates throughout government, then we certainly are in future going to lose influence around the world. Don't we need a much stronger sense of leadership from the top of the government and in particular from the Foreign Secretary?
Ian Murray.
Thank you to my honourable friend for the question, who also sits on the committee. But he's absolutely right. We questioned the Minister for the Commonwealth and the UN extensively on the reasons for the loss of the place on the ICJ, and he didn't seem to have any reasons for that loss. We questioned him in depth on what countries had fed back to him or what countries had said to him in terms of why they didn't vote for the UK or whether they voted for the UK in the first round and then changed their votes to other nations, and again didn't really have a reason. There did seem to be a significant amount of complacency in terms of the Foreign Office, and they will have to, ministers, the Foreign Secretary and the Foreign Office will have to significantly up their game post-Brexit to ensure the UK's voice is not diminished.
Just be a question.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I compliment my honourable friend in the committee for this report? Would my honourable friend agree with me that one of the results of this is damage to our reputation within the UN structure itself, and that clearly to take anything other than a very enthusiastic view as to how we can rectify this, how we can do better next time, would be foolish for our worldwide reputation?
Ian Murray.
Thank you to my honourable friend for that question, and he is absolutely right. We do have to learn the lessons, which is why we have asked for the private report to be shared with the committee when it is produced, so we can monitor what's happening in terms of future elections. And I do think one of the strongest recommendations in this report is to allow Parliament a role in these issues. There's many people in this chamber, including the distinguished former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and many of us who go on international delegations, who can just make sure that if there are key votes in international organisations, including the UN, that we can use those bilateral relationships to make the case as individual members of Parliament. I think that would help just to keep the subject at the top of the agenda when we're speaking to bilaterals across the world, and I think that's one of the key recommendations that this Parliament should seriously look at in terms of how we can all help to make sure that we can win these votes in the future.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will join me in congratulating the honourable gentleman in his presentation of the Foreign Affairs Committee's report, and indeed of the content of that report and all the members who are involved in it. May I ask him whether the committee took evidence on whether the cutbacks in budget to the Foreign Office had affected its ability to lobby for the judge?
Ian Murray.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question. Indeed, many of the reports that the Foreign Affairs Committee have produced and are currently producing have questioned the Foreign Office on whether or not they have the resource available. And the report that was presented by the chair of the committee last week it showed very clearly that the Foreign Office looked as though they were robbing Peter to pay Paul in terms of moving staff around the world to increase their presence with bilateral countries in the European Union, but that resource has come from other places. And Lord Ahmed, the Minister for the Commonwealth and the UN, said he wanted in this report to look at whether or not we should work on a Commonwealth caucus, but doesn't have any resources to be able to do that. So it seems that the priorities of the Foreign Office are certainly the EU, certainly the Commonwealth, and the developing relationships with China and other trading partners. But whether or not the Foreign Office have any additional resource, we know that they don't. There are bids into the Treasury, and would encourage the Treasury bench to look very seriously at those bids, so the Foreign Office is well resourced to be able to achieve these goals.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also congratulate the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South on securing this slot on the floor of the House. It's the second week in a row that the Foreign Affairs Committee has succeeded in presenting one of their reports. And can I also say how pleased I am to hear that the committee is visiting Birmingham today, and as a West Midlands MP, how much I welcome that outreach. Madam Deputy Speaker, I simply want to record that having listened to all of the exchanges, clearly those will be communicated to the Foreign Secretary and the ministerial team, and that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office will obviously respond in the formal way to this report in due course.
Ian Murray.
I'm grateful to the Minister for that response, and we look forward to the Foreign Office not only responding to the report, but also producing the lessons learned report for the committee, and to see what we can do in the future to ensure that Parliament can be involved in these voting processes.